Moving to Dr. Clifton Otto. Doctor?
Thank you. Dr. Clifton Otto, providing comments on agenda item 3 for the medical use working group report. The summary of the findings mentions that they relied primarily on the results of a confidential online rapid survey. So I'm assuming that the report the presentation will be discussing that today. But I thought it was very interesting to look at the part of the survey that asked people who are negatively impacted by the federal conflict with marijuana, and patients indicated 25%, providers about 22%. And to me, that's a significant number, and did not see anything specifically in the report that addressed that. There were some recommendations that I think tries to get around some of the negative consequences that patients are experiencing, but that does not directly address this federal conflict. I hope you have my written testimony before you. I made several recommendations like protecting and regulating collectives, overhauling the current testing program, having a seed bank for patients, allowing dispensaries to sell seeds and plants, allowing certain providers to decide what qualifies as an adequate supply. But also, I think a lot of this points to an overhaul that's needed in general of the program, hoping that's something that can be addressed by the legislature, like having guidelines for providers from the medical board.
And Dr. you have 30 seconds, please. 30 seconds.
Mandatory education for certifying providers, medical cannabis advisory board. And I did my own little survey asking our gubernatorial Democratic and Republican candidates where they stood on HCR 132. The Democratic candidate said yes, he would take action if elected. The Republicans said no. And so I would add a recommendation that the legislature and the next governor take further action to end the federal contract and protect the state authorized medical use of cannabis in Hawaii. Those are my comments. I'm available for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Task force members, any questions for Dr. Otto?
Yes, I have a question. Dr. Otto, this is Isaac Choi. Today we finally got testimony that says the plant itself is not harmful, but when you make distillates or use the THC or other chemicals in the plant in wrong dosage, it could have adverse reactions that put people in the emergency room or put their health in jeopardy. Didn't hear that testimony before in all these meetings. So if that's the case, then medical marijuana should be regulated like a pharmaceutical. Do you agree with that?
Well, so I think with anything that you put in your body, if it's not used properly, there can be adverse health effects. So as I've testified before, it depends on how it's being used and what is the source. I don't think it's appropriate to impose the regulations that go into making pharmaceutical products for every type of cannabis that patients are using. You have to look at how they're using it. And you mentioned dosing. Well, dosing, again, depends on the product, the strength, the route of administration, the other medical conditions that the patient has, and the condition that the patient is trying to treat. So it's a complex array of considerations, and that's why it's so important for those discussions to occur with the certifying provider. So I appreciated the comments from our previous testifiers about that relationship, the importance of that relationship, and the importance of having public education from the department to make sure that patients understand what this doctor-patient relationship requirement is under state law and what they should be expecting and obtaining from that relationship.
Dr. Otto, the other testifiers testified that over-regulation, heavy-handed enforcement, other rules and regulations was either denying access to the product or raising the price to a point where people can't afford it. But everything that just came out of your mouth just is more regulation. I mean, I just can't see. So do we need more regulation because it could harm people? Or should we just decriminalize this or legalize it and be done with all this regulation and enforcement?
Well, I would say that we need regulation that matches the use. So it's not just one set of regulations that applies to all cannabis use. I think that is part of what's adding to the regulatory burden of the dispensaries. They're testing every single product through every step of the manufacturing process. And testing unto itself is not a cure-all. You have to look at the current way that the program is structured. There are no national standards for analytical testing for cannabis. So we've adopted standards from other states. We have no gold standard that's being run at the Department of Health state lab. We have no, yes.
For medical marijuana, it seems that a whole bunch of testing is necessary to protect people's health. So medical marijuana should be far more expensive just because of the regulatory burden and overhead than recreational marijuana.
Are you serious?
Well, that would imply that we don't care about the health of our adult use users. So again, it comes down to use. If you're an immunocompromised patient,
remove 808 camera from the chat?
if you're an immunocompromised patient, then I think that the testing should be more comprehensive. So again, I think it all comes back to use and to the source and how the end user is going to be administering that to themselves.
Thank you, Dr. Otto. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Director Choi. Task force members, I know that you do want to get to the report on the investigation findings of the medical use working group, but we still have some testifiers. We have 3 remaining virtual testifiers. Sanford Hill. Mr. Hill.
Could I ask a question of Dr. Otto first? Do you mind?
Please.
Dr. Otto, in regards to testing requirements, you mentioned that you had some suggestions around regulating those entities that aren't currently licensed medical. Can you expand on that? And are you suggesting that everyone who is dispensing cannabis in the state of Hawaii has their product tested to the current testing standards?
Thank you, Executive Director Gons. So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking about how to regulate testing of material that's not coming from dispensaries. Is that correct?
Correct.
So that, of course, is a complex issue, because are you going to try and require that patients growing cannabis at home for their own personal use, that they go through certain regulations? Well, I don't think that's really going to be possible. Are we talking about groups of patients who are producing cannabis together in accordance with state law and just sharing it amongst themselves? Well, that seems like that's kind of a private patient issue. So, and I know this is something that your group has probably addressed, is what's the cutoff? Where do you draw the line between groups of patients growing together for their own personal use that are assuming the risk for that production of an agricultural product? And when does it start to become a public health hazard? And I think that's something that needs to be addressed by the legislature. What is that cutoff? Well, I know that there's a sunset on the number of patients who can grow together. The end of December, it was extended to 2024 to go to 5 patients per property. Well, maybe there needs to be a limit on that, and maybe there needs to be regulations for collectives or groups of patients over a certain amount where they have to comply with certain regulations. I would hope that such groups would be able to contribute, and I think you've talked about this, be able to contribute to an adult use market. So that's, I think, where a regulatory structure would make sense. And that requires an understanding by our state lawmakers of what patients are doing and what their needs are. And there needs to be a lot of education in that area still.
Thank you.
Does that wrap it up for Dr. Otto?
Just one more quick. Would you say that you mentioned that there is a risk. Would you say that there's a significant risk to those medical patients consuming untested products?
So I don't have any idea of what patients are using. That's part of the reason why I do not recommend that patients engage in the medical use of cannabis. I know some of my colleagues did mention that. And I would suggest that they stay away from this term recommend. Of course, we can't prescribe because I don't know what my patients are gaining access to. I cannot comment on whether it's dangerous or not. So that's just beyond my awareness. And I consciously stay out of that because of my DEA prescribing registration, which prevents me from being engaged with helping patients gain access to an illegal Schedule I drug. So my involvement ends at certification and providing ongoing education for my patients so that at least they have somebody to talk to about what they're doing or what they're using.
Thank you, Doc. All right, does that do it, task force members, for Dr. Otto? All right, we're ready to hear from Sanford Hill.